I saw that in the last podcast, I forgot to put the sound recording to go from the headphones. So even though I'm wearing the headphone, the sound came from the computer. So it's not as crisp as this one. Each time I start a podcast, I have to watch out for a few things, and I'm not always as careful as I should be. Sometimes I have to re-record, but I heard the sound. It's fairly audible, and you can just turn up the volume or use headphones to listen to it, okay? Because I'm not going to re-record it. It's in good quality, don't worry. Okay, chapter 7, the last chapter: forced migrations, fragility, resilience, and policy responses. How do we need to deal with food crises and forced migration? The key message is here: the decision to migrate is complex, driven by a wide range of context-specific push and pull factors, including economic, social, and cultural, environmental, and safety factors. So people may feel unsafe and leave. People may face relentless climate hazards, resource limitations, conflicts, ethnic issues, and so on and so forth. Forced displacements, when people must leave their original place of residence, results from various triggering factors, events, and shocks. These include climate change, armed conflict, criminal violence, and economic shocks, which are often interrelated, multiplying their impact. If you're poor and you're forced to move, and you might leave half the family there or not have a good job where you end up going, and so on and so forth. About 4/5 of dispersed people have experienced acute hunger and malnutrition. So in this context, we are coming back to food crisis impacts on forced migrations. Migration, including forced migration, constitutes an important adaptation strategy with both challenges and opportunities. It can have benefits for migrants and for hosting and sending communities. So if I go from India to the US, I can send money back, so I hopefully benefited the US by doing what I did there in terms of my education, teaching, and other community services, and sent money back for the family, and hopefully both places got better. And now I'm back in India doing things in India, so overall, that's how it works. It's a fundamental component of economic development, allowing individuals to respond to economic incentives or seek out better opportunities. Policies that restrict the rights of migrants to work and choose a place of residence in hosting countries should be considered barriers to economic and social integration and development. Migration requires resources and socio-economic networks, and often those who stay behind are the most vulnerable. To improve the outcomes of forced migration, it's critical to invest in research to develop better tailored policies that expand the positive effects of migration and limit negative ones on migrants and their families, sending communities, and hosting communities. Okay? Adopt non-traditional methods and analytical approaches to trace migration, to keep track of the diaspora. These can provide new research avenues to better understand the key factors driving forced migrations. I didn't go because I was forced, but I just used that as an example of how benefits flow back and forth. But here we are talking about forced migrations, so these can provide new research avenues to better understand the key factors driving forced migrations, including irregular migration, which is inherently more difficult to measure and analyze. Irregular is, crossing boundaries, being trucked in, being smuggled in, and using boats to make entries, and so on and so forth. Align social protection and climate action objectives. Finally, we mentioned climate in this situation of food crisis, but social protection and climate action objectives have to be synergized. As conflict and climate change further worsen the global humanitarian crises, and drive forced migrations, humanitarian and climate investments must mutually support peace, security, and climate adaptation and mitigation. Glad that in the last chapter we are coming to it. Identify measures for accelerating the transition from humanitarian aid to development policy, and for better integrating refugees into hosting communities. Different options should be considered for integration, with special attention given to the needs of displaced women. Prioritize addressing forced inability to move in the face of adverse conditions. That is the situation those who are not able or choose not to relocate. a problem that has received little policy attention. So you may end up, watching people take risk, stay in a place where they shouldn't stay. Forced migration would be an option in that case. Let's say fishermen with fish stocks dropping, sea level rising, salinization of groundwater, etc. And they are not able to move or not willing to move. Okay, so just to read a few statistics, 1 in every 7 people in the world is a migrant. 1 in every 7 people in the world is a migrant, and yet xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiments seem to forget these basic facts. 763 million are internal migrants and 281 million people are international migrants. Big countries like India have a lot of internal migrations, and they have a lot of ethnic problems associated with them. International migrations surged by 107 million over the past 20 years. 52% of international migrants are men, about 1/3 are 15 to 34 years old, and a large share originate from rural areas. We have to understand the drivers behind that, as we said. Maybe job opportunities are missing, or farming is becoming harder, labor is getting harder, low income jobs, and so on and so forth, or just simply non-availability of water and other resources. Forced migration may also result in irregular migration. Apprehensions at the US-Mexico border set a new record in fiscal year 2022 and almost tripled compared to 2019. So you know that it's a big issue for the US, and some outrageous and violent statements are made by some, but such is the problem. There are about 84 million internally displaced persons, refugees, and asylum seekers. Most people displaced by armed conflict or other forces are from developing countries, and 80% experience acute food insecurity. So we are combining here drivers of forced migration and how they exacerbate food insecurity. Climate displacement has received special attention in recent years. 75% of recent displacements are due to natural disasters, and many people displaced by climate change are women, who are also at greater risk of violence. So you can see how most men migrate voluntarily when forced to migrate, and most women are forced to migrate, and they are exposed to more violence or risk of violence, and often it's driven by climate change. They simply cannot cope with the lack of water and food and basic amenities, and then they decide to move. Women move when they see that children are going to suffer, and it's simply not tenable to stay in the same place. So they take great risks to do, dislocate themselves in that sense. International migrants and refugees in low, middle, and high income countries. So international migrant population in low and middle income countries. Dashed lines are international migrants in high income countries. Refugees in high and low income, middle income countries here. International migrant population in millions of people, and refugee population in millions of people. So you can see refugee population from low and middle income countries dropped, and then it has picked up more recently for various reasons, like the continued wars in the Middle East, and now there are other wars. Some are not qualified as wars, but they are conflicts, armed sometimes, so they do drive refugees. And here is the high income country refugee population, which is not, it's not zero, and it's not as high as low and middle income countries, but still significant, which is surprising, right? So here you can see that international migrant populations in low and middle income countries has grown, but remains remarkably lower than international migrant population in high income countries, because people choose to migrate. This doesn't separate the forced migrations and voluntary migrations. Okay, factors driving migrations. Look at migration here: social and cultural. When I went to the US, it was pretty common for people from India with education in certain fields to move from certain institutions. It was easier. There was a channel, pipeline, network, and so on. Can be environmental, so this can be one way. This has a feedback. I migrate, I can help my family migrate, and so on. Safety, so that can be two-way as well in terms of feedbacks, and they all have relations with each other as well, and economic. Okay, so environmental and economic can be related in a positive and negative way. So this can go both ways either. You can look at the details in terms of arrows indicating direction of causality, which is bidirectional in most of the cases between each factor in migration, as well as between the factors themselves. Okay, this is not bidirectional. These are all bidirectional and they are related to each other. Okay, so just to read off, increasing crises in human systems and the natural world will not abate in coming years, and the time to step up our efforts to develop a more permanent, sustainable response is now. Okay, so let me leave this here, and we'll come back and probably be able to wrap up a few points on regional developments. We'll look at Africa, Latin America, Asia, and so on in terms of crisis responses. Okay.